taking control of the future of our own country.
I want to know what Plan B is. Well, so do you. Go and tell us.
In 3 days' time, Scotland will decide whether or not it wants to be an independent nation.
Don't listen to the lies and scaremongering of the SNP.
A generation ago, independence was a fringe obsession. Today, it's a mainstream ambition.
What the Scottish people value is under threat if we don't vote yes.
Scotland is on the cusp of making history. The eyes of the world are upon Scotland.
It has shaken the British political establishment to its roots. Why has it happened?
I would be heartbroken if this family of nations was torn apart.
My name is Alan Little. I've worked for the BBC for more than 30 years, reporting from all over the world.
Refugees have been flooding here since the fighting began. 50,000 so far. Alan Little, BBC News, Behatch.
But Scotland has always been the place I've called home. This is the village in Galloway in rural southwest Scotland where I grew up. I was born here in 1959. I left when I was 18 and I haven't been back to the house I grew up in since. I've come to meet Peter Ross, the current owner.
Hello, Peter.
Hello, Alan. Gosh, I know
Nice to meet you.
Right.
Can I have a look around?
Yeah, of course, yes.
Thank you.
Our old house was built around 1900 by two Scottish brothers who had spent most of their lives in the British colonies in Africa. They gave the house a name that, to me, carried the exotic stamp of empire. It celebrated our remote little village's connection with the projection of British power around the world.
What struck me even in the 70s when I was living here was that Scotland still felt connected to the empire rather than to Europe.
Yes, absolutely. And there's all these linkages going back and forward across the empire that's gone, really, isn't it?
To my grandparents' generation, the empire bound Scotland to a powerful British identity. But the empire on which the sun never set is long gone. Can it really be true that the sun might soon also set on the union between England and Scotland?
Whatever the outcome of the referendum, the political landscape here and across Britain will never be the same again. So how, in the last 40 years, did we get to where we are today?
Well, in 1974, if you'd said in 2014 there will be a referendum so close that Scotland might become independent, people would have recoiled in disbelief.
For much of the 20th century, Scotland's shared sense of Britishness was powerful, an identity most in Scotland didn't even think about challenging.
Britain is an island nation. On its shores, generations of craftsmen have made great ships for the world, but nowhere in such profusion as on the River Clyde in Scotland.
Drive along the banks of the Clyde nowadays and you see that only the ghosts of an industrial past remain.
When I was growing up in Scotland, the British state counted for an awful lot. It bound the British together in a common purpose, a great kind of shared enterprise. The British state dug coal, it milled steel, it built ships. There were shipyards all along this stretch of the river here. It even manufactured motor cars. But by the 1970s, all that had begun to change.
I think the idea that the UK was going to be a welfare state that you could be proud of, that would look after its citizens from cradle to grave, I think that was seen as a very creditable mission for the kind of modern British state that was supposed to emerge. after the Second World War. And I think that up until the mid-1970s, people generally felt that that was being achieved, but at that point, things began to go wrong.
Now to give you 1 gallon, sir. That'll get you to your nearest garage.
In the early 1970s, Britain suffered a series of economic shocks. In 1973, a gallon of 4-star doubled in price to hit 73 pence. Standards of living dropped. People started to see that in the post-imperial world, they were subject to forces beyond their control. In Scotland, North Sea oil, recently discovered, acquired political symbolism.
Now back to the election campaign here in Scotland.
In the October 1974 election, Conservative, deferential rural Galloway, where I lived, returned a Scottish Nationalist MP to Westminster. I remember the shock of it.
Hello, Scottish National Party?
The Nationalists claim that they're now the fastest growing political party in Europe and that they've doubled their vote in every election since the war.
Nationalists saw oil as Scotland's economic route to independence, but most Scots seemed unimpressed.
In the 1970s, the SNP was a classic catch-all party. It wanted to win support from Labour voters, Tory voters, from anywhere. It didn't like to define itself on the left-right spectrum because it was a Scottish National Party first, last and always. And I think that caused enormous difficulties. It hadn't really settled on what kind of political party it was beyond believing in independence.
But there was something wrong with the Britain that most Scots still adhered to. It seemed preoccupied with managing its own decline. In my first year at Edinburgh University, as the winter of discontent took hold, the most pressing question we debated in our politics class was whether Britain had become ungovernable. My old university friend Laurie O'Donnell got involved in the student union with me. He went on to become a Labour city councillor. We had some SNP friends back then, but neither of us thought they'd become the dominant force in Scotland.
How would you characterise the SNP of those years?
They were a bit madcap, really. Mixed. There were some really good people in there, but they did attract a kind of bit of a lunatic fringe as well. They tended to be a bit, certainly anti-English. There was a real sense that they were anti-English.
Nationalism in Scotland has never been ethnic. It's never been linguistic. And of course, the English are irritators. I mean, they're perfectly lovely people. The only problem is that with Scotland 5 million and they 58 million, there are far too many of them. And somebody once said that, you know, if an elephant is in bed with you, it will roll over in the middle of the night and flatten you, but it doesn't intend to and doesn't even know it.
Scotland's first real flirtation with devolution came in 1979. It was the first vote I ever cast. I was 19 years old. The referendum that year offered an elected Scottish Assembly.
Scotland didn't say no and didn't say yes. It said, maybe, well, perhaps we'd better go homeward to think again.
Scotland voted narrowly in favour, but the vote fell short of a 40% threshold that Westminster had demanded. And more than 1 in 3 Scots didn't even vote.
It was an odd period. I mean, history has rewritten it to an extent, but at the end of the day, the turnout was low, the majority for a Scottish Assembly was slim, and there was really no broad-based appetite for it at that point.
The day after the referendum, the Glasgow Herald ran a cartoon that summed up the mood. The idea that Scotland the Brave had, when tested, in fact been feared, entered the national narrative.
In 1974, in the second election of that year in October, the SNP won, I think, 10 or 11 seats. But by 1979, these seats had virtually all disappeared. So Scottish opinion, I think, veered from one direction to another. So having made kind of a breakthrough, the SNP rather lost their way towards the end of the 1970s.
Nationalism failed to take hold. Most Scots were either indifferent or overtly hostile to independence. In fact, in the general election that followed that failed referendum, 1 in 3 Scots voted Conservative. Easy to forget now.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister.
In 1979, when Margaret Thatcher came to power, there were 22 Tory MPs from Scotland.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Margaret Thatcher set out to make Britain governable. She would represent a radical break with her predecessors and the management of decline. She would take on what she saw as the excessive power of the trade unions. The unions that had recently almost brought Britain to a standstill. A turbulent, decade-long journey lay ahead that would reshape Britain and Scotland's place in it.
Newton Grange is the kind of pit village which breeds mining legends. For nearly 100 years it sent its sons underground.
In 1984, there were 21,000 coal miners in Scotland. Now there are a few hundred. When the miners took on the Thatcher government won. Today, it's the heritage industry, like this former mine-turned-museum, that employs miners now. Britain was an island of coal. It was built on coal. Coal, like empire, was a shared British experience, a common enterprise. Nicky Wilson went into a pit near Glasgow in the late 1960s at the age of 17.
As a young man, I used to love sitting and listening to the older men and talking about the hard times they had, the struggles they had to get decent wages, decent conditions. It's never been a Scottish miners' union or a Welsh miners' union. We had our areas within the union, but the Britishness was always important. It's a national union. That was where our strength lay.
These industrial communities were tough places for the SNP to win support. Working class voters would say to nationalist activists, but we work for something called the National Coal Board, or British Steel, or British Shipbuilders. That's what pays our wages. Our factories are integrated with plants elsewhere in the UK. Are you really going to unpick all of that? But it was to be unpicked anyway. Mrs. Thatcher wanted a modern, lean, productive Britain. There was no place in it for old industries that had lost their global markets and could no longer pay their way. But slowly, something else would be chipped away as the old industries fell into the dust. A culture, a way of thinking, a set of loyalties. Nicky is still proud of the principles he spent his whole working life fighting for, the cross-border solidarity of the old trade union movement. He will not be voting for Scottish independence.
Does it spring from that experience of shared solidarity with miners elsewhere in the UK?
Yes, we were always taught by my mentors and people, experienced people within the union, that a fight for one is a fight for everyone. The minute you start to splinter and separate, then you weaken yourself. And that goes against the grain everything we were taught within the National Union of Mine Workers.
My parents' generation were born in the 1930s. The Britain they inherited had emerged with enormous moral stature from the shared struggle of the war. They grew into young adults in the Britain of the nationalised industries and the post-war welfare state. That Britain was now changing fast under a reforming Conservative government.
We can argue about the deindustrialisation of the 1980s, whether it was necessary or inevitable or needlessly brutal. But one unintended consequence was this. These industries were great pan-British enterprises, and the communities that sustained them were bedrocks not just of labour loyalty, but of British identity and solidarity in Scotland. And they've all but gone. And with each year that passes, they recede further into the middle distance of our collective memory.
And I think at the moment when they gained power, allowing people to sink or swim and no longer supporting defunct industries and all that, even if the community consequences of that were devastating. I think at that moment, unbeknownst to themselves, because they just didn't have a subtle enough understanding of the politics of the Union, they began the kind of breakup of the old Britain.
As the old industries followed empire into history, a new Britain was being born, reshaping some of the values by which the country lived. In that new Britain, the market would drive wealth creation, the frontiers of the state would be rolled back, and increasingly, the market is global. The company that lights your home now probably isn't even British anymore. Jaguar, a British icon, was taken over first by the Americans, and this Jaguar was made by an Indian-owned company.
Some people say that we're not a Scottish party, but neither are we an English party, nor a Welsh party, nor an Irish party. We're the party of the whole United Kingdom.
In the 1980s, Scotland began to rebel against this new Britain. In 1987, support for Mrs. Thatcher fell off a cliff. Her 21 MPs were cut to 10.
The perception, the deep perception was industries, many of traditional industries were being closed, that Mrs. Thatcher was doing nothing to protect them, that she was anti-Scottish and her party was anti-Scottish.
In 1988, Margaret Thatcher addressed the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, the closest thing the country then had to a national parliament. Christianity should be about spiritual redemption, she told them, not social reform. And she quoted St. Paul, "If a man will not work, he shall not eat."
Clearly she thought this was an opportunity to deliver a sort of sermon. I mean, it was sort of theological self-defense, almost.
It's not the creation of wealth that is wrong, but love of money for its own sake. The spiritual dimension comes in deciding what one does with the wealth.
My reaction, like many other people there, was that she's kind of got this wrong. She hasn't really understood the mood of the nation at this time or the nature of this occasion.
There is no hierarchy in the Church of Scotland, no priests, no bishops. A core doctrine is the equality of all believers. Ranged against Mrs. Thatcher that day was a Scottish egalitarian spirit in sober Presbyterian flesh and blood.
Certainly confirmed that Margaret Thatcher herself and her government's policies and the values that underlay these were uncongenial to Scottish people.
You could almost hear the bonds of union loosening under the impact of this extraordinary confrontation.
It was a key moment in Scotland's long journey to where it is now, because many saw it as emblematic of the divergent paths that Scotland and the United Kingdom now seemed to be walking. You could sense the dismay in this hall, even among small C conservative church-going Scotland, about the values that they'd come to associate with Mrs. Thatcher's Britain.
Had there been a form of one-nation Toryism of the kind that had been evident in some of the previous Conservative governments, the move towards devolution and independence wouldn't have happened so quickly.
In 1992, the Scottish Conservatives increased their representation at Westminster from 10 to 11 out of Scotland's 72 MPs. Scotland was still voting decisively against Conservative governments for the fourth consecutive time, and on each occasion a team of Conservative ministers appointed by and answerable to the Prime Minister in London moved into St Andrew's House to govern Scotland. Opposition MPs and grassroots activists began to talk of a democratic deficit. They argued that Conservative policies supported by an English electorate were being forced on Scotland, despite having been repeatedly rejected at the ballot box. The very legitimacy of Westminster to govern at all in Scotland was now being challenged.
there was a strong feeling that Scotland's different, and Scotland's differences, the needs, hopes and aspirations of the Scottish people aren't sufficiently being taken into account by Westminster government, and we need a devolved parliament.
The belief that Westminster had no mandate in Scotland became common currency. Labour, by far the largest party in Scotland, walked onto that territory and claimed it.
It was Labour rather than the SNP which really pushed the argument that there was a democratic deficit, that the Tories were illegitimate, that conservatism was an alien ideology. And that, of course, was a nationalist argument.
Once at best lukewarm about devolution, Labour were now its champions. 10 years on, and with Labour back in power, devolution's time had come. On July the 1st, 1999, the Queen led the ceremonies at the opening of Scotland's first Parliament since 1707. It had been backed by an overwhelming majority of voters. But this, above all, was Labour's baby. The new First Minister, Donald Dewar, was its founding father.
Walter Scott wrote that only a man with soul so dead could have no sense, no feel for his native land. For me, and I think in this I speak at least for any Scot today, this is a proud moment.
Scotland's Parliament was created to end constitutional uncertainty, not to become a stepping stone to independence.
Devolution within the UK, Labour resolutely believed, was what they called the settled will of the Scottish people. This Parliament would meet their democratic aspirations. Above all, it would see off the SNP as an electoral threat. In the words of George Robertson, Tony Blair's Defence Secretary, it would kill nationalism stone dead.
One of the great problems was that there was an expectation that once you had the Parliament, that would be the end. It would be all that the Scots wanted. I think there was a failure to appreciate that the creation of this Parliament would also create a new dynamic in Scottish politics, new expectations. And one very important point is it gave the SNP the opportunity to become a governing party for the first time.
For in the hands of Alec Salmond, the SNP had become a very different kind of party.
He led the SNP from a fringe movement. When he took over as leader in 1990, it had 3 MPs. They were not a serious force, and they were not taken seriously. And at that point, if you said an independent Scotland couldn't survive economically, no one or very few people would have disagreed with you.
While Labour's top Scottish talent went back to Westminster, believing the nationalist threat had been seen off once and for all, the SNPs, for the most part, stayed at home and prospered. In 2011, the Nationalists astonished even themselves by winning an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament.
The SNP have been bestowed trust by the people in a way that no party ever has before in a Scottish election. We'll take that mandate and that trust forward.
That SNP victory made a referendum on independence inevitable. But when the referendum terms were signed, there remained disagreement on one thing. Alec Salmond wanted a third option, enhanced devolution, but still within the UK. Polls suggested that that was what most Scots wanted. The same polls said support for independence was stuck around 30%. So David Cameron said no third option. The choice should be decisive, independence or not.
Gentlemen, thank you. That's mine to take away. Sorry, it's with a number. There we are, now give you back your pen.
If Scotland votes yes on Thursday, will David Cameron regret shaking hands with Alec Salmond on that deal?
It was very much the sense of the time that this issue, independence or not independence, was so clear-cut in the choice it posed that it was necessary to focus on that. With the benefit of hindsight, which always gives an advantage, then perhaps an additional question might have been appropriate.
All 3 Westminster Party leaders have argued passionately for the union. But are they making errors of judgment?
It's a momentous decision. It is a decision forever. It's not a decision you can make now and undo tomorrow. And if you're fed up with the effing Tories, give them a kick and then maybe we'll think again. This is totally different.
Don't listen to the lies and scaremongering of the SNP.
They are fighting Alec Salmond, the SNP, and what they see as narrow nationalism. But is that their real enemy?
This isn't about the SNP, it's not about me, it's not about any political party. It's about the right of Scotland to have a government of our choice.
I see the changes that have swept Scotland these 30 years reflected in many of the friends of my youth. After we left university, Laurie O'Donnell became a Labour councillor in Dundee. He fought the SNP. But now, the Nationalists are no longer the only ones who have embraced the Yes campaign. Laurie has too.
I'm not a nationalist, I'm not an SNP voter, but they're anti-Trident. They support free education for all. All of that seems to me to be a core of what I believe in.
30 years ago, I would not have believed that you would have been a supporter of independence.
Well, I think you probably weren't listening to me then. Because I've always said it's a democratic question. People should decide how best to govern their lives. For me, it's not about independence, it's about democracy.
There is a mystery about this. Social attitude surveys reveal that Scots do not seem to be more left-wing issue by issue than anyone else, at least not by very much.
Why then does Scotland make such radically different choices at elections? Why does this central Edinburgh constituency return a Labour MP dependably at election after election? When I first lived here, this was solid Conservative territory, utterly safe, and Edinburgh was by and large a Conservative city.
It seems to me there has been a long, slow revolt in Scotland against what is perceived here to be the growing inequality of British society. I am struck by how little of this debate at grassroots level has been about national identity, and how much of it has been driven by the idea that an independent Scotland, rightly or wrongly, could be a fairer, more equal society.
If Scotland votes no on Thursday, what is the future for the Union? Will the genie of Scottish independence just go back into its bottle? One view is that devolution is just a work in progress, a staging post in a long journey that will one day end in independence. But there's an alternative view. One leading Labour activist told me quite confidently that this was the high watermark for independence, that after a no vote, the tide will go out. When, he said, will the nationalist stars be so perfectly aligned again, with an unpopular Tory government at Westminster, the tail end of a long recession, austerity cuts in spending, and an SNP majority at Holyrood? When will that happen for them again, he said.
But what is the glue that holds the Union together now? Can it compare with the power of empire, the shared enterprise of the old industrial heartlands, the building of a new Britain after the war? The sentiment of Britishness endures for sure. Many Scots still feel British to their core. But how many? If Scotland votes no this week, is that it? Is the Union saved? If I've learned anything from reporting this campaign, it's this: that future generations of Scots will need reasons to love and trust the Union as our parents and grandparents did, rather than simply to fear the alternative.
Drama next tonight on BBC One, reopening a case with occult connections. The new series of New Tricks continues. While over on BBC Three now, a UK exclusive interviews with Reva Steenkamp's parents. Oscar Pistorius, The Truth.